The Pergamon Altar was one of the most famous and magnificent monuments in antiquity. The entire facade has been recreated in Berlin in order to display over 100 of the original marble reliefs. They were transported more than 1,000 miles from Anatolia in Turkey. They make up a frieze running 400 feet, over twice the length of the facade of St. Paul's. Together with the Elgin marbles, the most important Greek sculpture in the world. Its acquisition by the German government was the most ruthlessly efficient archaeological coup of the 19th century. The altar on its frieze had been commissioned by the powerful Attalid kings in around 180 BC. It commemorates their military glories, using the myth of the victory of the Olympian gods over the giants, a unique propaganda machine for Greek civilization.
Ironically, the altar was built just 50 years before the end of the Attalid dynasty. It's been far more effective propaganda for the Germans. But in 1992, the mayor of an obscure Turkish town from the back of beyond staged a demonstration in front of the Pergamon Museum. It was extensively covered by German national television. He wanted his altar back.
Bergamo, the modern town of Pergamon, is a bumpy 3-hour bus ride from Izmir. When Alexander the Great drove the Persians out of Anatolia in 330 BC, the whole of this region fell under Greek influence, a period known as Hellenistic. After Alexander's death, his generals carved out great kingdoms for themselves. The Attalids were looked down on as Johnny-come-latelys, but they were to dominate the region until the Romans took over in 130 BC. Nowadays, the only reason we remember Pergamon is the altar. Certainly no visitor to Bergamo is allowed to forget, thanks to the mayor's campaigning tactics.
This is Altar of Zeus.
Oh, that's a good,
we say
that's
here,
a good poster.
Yeah. Altar of Zeus belongs to Bergamo. We want it back. This is olive oil. It's exported olive oil. The company made the Altar of Zeus here, and he says we want the altar back with olive oil.
I managed to escape the mayor of Bergamo's sales patter for a while. A local archaeologist had agreed to show me the original site of the altar up on the ancient acropolis. Under the Attalid kings, Pergamon became the center of one of the most ambitious building programs in antiquity. There's little to show for it now. The Attalids had been determined to build a city that would rival Athens itself. For 100 years, Pergamon was the Getty Museum of the ancient world. Money was no object. The Attalids were among the first to appreciate the power of art as political propaganda.
So this is the Temple of Athena here, yes?
This is the site of what was once a courtyard surrounded by magnificent colonnades. There was a small temple dedicated to Athena at one end. Little remains of the famous library next to the Athena temple, which rivaled that of Alexandria. Later, a besotted Mark Antony was to give its 200,000 scrolls to Cleopatra.
You haven't shown it to me yet. I've come all this way to see the altar of Zeus.
The jewel in the crown of the Acropolis was the great altar, dedicated to Zeus.
Oh, that's extraordinary. So there it is at last. That's absolutely amazing.
The altar was in reality a monumental temple, which contained a sacrificial area.
So this is the original site of the great altar of Zeus. It has all the charm of a rotting gum. Those are the 5 original steps, which were the platform of the altar, known as the crepidoma. The Germans very kindly left those. And they also very thoughtfully left these 2 trees to indicate exactly where the original site was so no one would ever forget. Of course, the original visitor to antique Pergamon would have probably approached the altar from behind on this axis, from the old road over there, in order to confront the full glory of the altar.
The frieze depicts the mythological war between the giants and the gods of Olympus, an epic drama known to the Greeks as the Gigantomachy. The giants were depicted in grotesque forms with wings, serpent-like legs, and the heads of beasts. The altar probably celebrates the Attalids' defeat of the Gauls who had invaded Anatolia. The quality of the sculpture is best appreciated in the almost surreal fragments, the contrast of fish scale, muscle and flesh. The energy and complexity are typical of the innovations of the Hellenistic school. The contorted poses and emotional realism of the figures contrast dramatically with the classical dignity of the Elgin marbles, sculpted 250 years earlier.
So the altar is 35 meters square, about 35 meters either side, and as you walked along this side, you would have been struck by that brilliantly, deeply carved marble frieze, which would have been above the 5 steps that you saw on the other side. About 2 meters of this incredible frieze running right along, 35 meters. So once you've walked down that side of the great altar of Zeus, you're confronted with the most staggering view, the heart of which, the center of which, is the steepest theater in antiquity, running right up the hillside. And this is the heart, the tectonic core of the city, if you will. And you must remember that Pergamon is one of the most dynamic examples of urban townscape design in antiquity.
Visitors to the Great Altar would have climbed 20 steps to its colonnaded entrance. Despite its fame as a tourist attraction in antiquity, Pergamon had escaped the attentions of European antique hunters for most of the 19th century.
In 1871, a recently unified Germany was scanning the horizon for antiquities in fierce competition from Britain and France. They were the first to establish organizations, command posts, if you will, to locate prize opportunities to acquire not only individual sculptures, but entire buildings. The Ishtar Gate from Babylon, the market from Miletus.
At exactly that time, a German road engineer working for the Ottomans, Karl Eumenes, found some fragments of sculpture at Pergamon. He sent them to Berlin, but it was 8 years before they were identified as probably from the long-lost Pergamon frieze. The Crown Prince of Prussia himself authorized the excavations. He insisted on maximum discretion.
Karl Eumenes had stumbled on a find that was to prove more important than he could have possibly imagined. Just as the Macedonians colonized the hilltops of Anatolia, so Eumenes occupied the acropolis of the Attalid kings. Just before he began his first excavation, he brandished his pickaxe in the air in front of 14 bemused workmen and made an extraordinary proclamation.
In the name of the protector of the Royal Museum, best-loved man, the unconquered warrior, heir to the most marvelous throne in the world, in the name of our Crown Prince Friedrich, may this work be blessed and flourish. More the speech of a colonial explorer than an archaeologist. Before his discovery, no one had had any idea what had happened to the frieze. The slabs had been dismantled some 1,000 years before and used as building material.
When the Byzantines occupied Pergamon, they were frequently harassed and threatened by the Arabs and Turks. So they threw up additional walls, ramparts really, along the perimeter of the old Acropolis. And because they were rather bigoted Christians, they were no great respecters of what they thought were pagan sculptures, and they completely raided the altar of Zeus, taking away over 100 slabs of marvelously sculpted marble, which they brought over here, reversed and incorporated into the wall.
Eumenes excavated the slabs from the wall, occasionally resorting to dynamite. In spite of these unorthodox techniques, he boasted of having rescued the frieze from local peasants who would otherwise have burnt the marble in their lime kilns, a common excuse among 19th century plunderers. Quite how the peasants would have known about the frieze when it was interred in the walls, he never explained. Despite the triumphal installation of his frieze in Berlin, Uman insisted on being buried here, close to its original site. Uman's excavations had provoked little interest among the Ottomans. They were happy to part with a few pagan stones in order to strengthen their ties with Germany. The mayor of Bergamo doesn't see why Turks today should continue to be deprived of the altar because of a previous generation's indifference.
Think, in London, Big Ben. Big Ben is a part of London, a part of the city of London. Think, an Ottoman Pasha came to England, take Big Ben to Bergamo. And you came from England now to Bergamo and you see Big Ben in Bergamo. It's silly. It's silly.
He believes in catching supporters young. Local schoolchildren have been lent a hand by Bergamo TV to make their own video about the altar.
Söylenceler destan çağını anlatır. Mitolojinin bugünkü adıdır. Söylenceler tarih değildir ama tarih sevgisi söylencelerle başlamalı diyebilirim.
Let's teach our children the true history. Zeus altars made in Bergamo to stay in acropolis of Bergamo. It's not made for Berlin.
But you understand that it was bought totally legally by the German government at the end of the 19th century.
I don't think so. Only the clever Germans say that. Altar of Zeus is not taken from Bergamo legally.
Have you got evidence for that?
Sure, I have evidence. The most important evidence is the notebook of Karl Humann. The notebook of Karl Humann now is in the libraries. Whoever wants to know the truth, please look at and read the papers of Karl Humann.
The mayor claims that the Germans exported the frieze before they got permission from the Ottoman government. The Germans claim that their acquisition of the frieze was one of the cleaner art deals of the 19th century. Under Ottoman law, archaeological finds were divided 1/3 to the excavator, 1/3 to the landowner, waived in this case, and 1/3 to the government. The Germans ended up buying out the Ottomans' third for just £80,000 in today's money, a minuscule fraction of the £250 million it might now fetch in an auction between the Getty Museum and Japan.
I suppose you could ask whether the German government really went to very much trouble explaining to the Ottomans just how important their find was, but given their hunger for artistic trophies generally, it would have been surprising if they had.
Uman excavated the majority of the slabs within an amazing 7 months. They were dispatched to Berlin by ox cart, battleship, train and barge, and arrived in under 2 months. Soon after, the Ottomans introduced strict new export regulations for antiquities. The Germans had only just got away with it. The final destination of the frieze was Museum Island, a grandiose collection of galleries and museums built on a former swamp in the middle of the River Spree in Berlin. The plan was the brainchild of King Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia.
There is a drawing by himself, by the king himself, who was quite a good architect, showing this acropolis on the River Spree, Athens on the Spree. And this was so impressing, this design and this idea, that from that time on, no longer any discussion where to build the museum, but on the island.
So when the Pergamon Altar arrived in Berlin, there was no question it had to be in Museum Island.
Yeah, no question.
Before any decision was taken on how to exhibit the frieze, Berliners threw a fancy dress party to celebrate its arrival.
A huge model, a plaster model of the altar was built, and there was a huge outdoor festival, thousands of people participating. I think 7,000 onlookers and more than 1,000 artists participating in ancient costumes. it must have been a really great occasion, perhaps the biggest festival ever held in Berlin.
There was good reason to celebrate.
This was the period after Germany had regained its national unity in the Franco-Prussian War. And Germans, of course, and especially Berliners, were immensely proud of their new role, Berlin national capital for the first time in its history. And of course they sensed that having such a treasure in its walls would add enormously to the prestige of Berlin as a new national capital.
They were so proud of their new acquisition that a museum was built on the island specially to house the altar. This was later knocked down and an even grander one erected on the same site. Construction continued even during the dire economic crisis of the Weimar Republic. It opened in 1930 and immediately became the main attraction of Museum Island.
Behind this imposing row of pillars lies another huge museum full of invaluable treasures of art and culture of all peoples and times. The world-famous Pergamon Altar.
It's not surprising that a monument to the ambitions of a Hellenistic dynasty began to serve a similar purpose for Germany. The mixture of myth, melodrama, and allegory is Wagnerian. The frieze portrays primordial chaos being mastered by the gods. Originally, that probably referred to the victory of the Attalids over the Gauls, but at the end of the 19th century, it could have been interpreted as Prussia mastering the other German states. Later, Germany mastering the world. The power of the altar was ideally suited to Nazi taste. Albert Speer, Hitler's favorite architect, acknowledged its influence in the facade of the Nuremberg Stadium, one of the most famous buildings of the new Germany.
After Hitler's accession to power, it was certainly used as an instrument to demonstrate that German culture was at the head of, or in the top group of national cultures.
Like a modern Caesar, he stands on the balcony to receive the salutes of the athletes of 50 nations.
They used it, for instance, to influence the International Olympic Committee before the Olympic Games of 1936. A dinner was held here in front of the altar. The world was in a way deceived about the character of the Nazi regime in Germany, because a peaceful, very peaceful and cooperative facade was put up, and the altar was used as part of this facade.
For 14 days, the eyes of the world will be on Berlin, and Germany wants to send away every one of her millions of visitors as a friend.
Die Hitlerjugend bei der Arbeit die Skulpturen des berühmten Pergamon Altars.
During the war, the Hitler Youth sandbagged the Pergamon Altar, and later the frieze was stored under an anti-aircraft tower, just as well as the museum skylight was to sustain a direct hit. At the end of the war, the Russians seized the frieze as war reparations, and only returned it in 1956 as a goodwill gesture to East Germany, after triumphantly exhibiting it in Moscow and Leningrad. After the panels had been painstakingly reassembled, VIPs from the Eastern Bloc celebrated with characteristic style.
It was a very important event. Culturally interested people from the eastern countries, especially from Poland, for instance, from Czechoslovakia, came in buses and enjoyed not only the Pergamon Museum, but the entire era of the Museum Insel. And from that moment on, from the reopening of the Pergamon Museum, the Museum Island regained its importance as a cultural center.
The mayor of Bergamo's demonstration in Berlin opened another chapter in the political exploitation of the altar, which started the moment Eumenes began his excavations just over 100 years ago.
Well, these protests are part of a wave of protests against the Western museums, and one can have a certain understanding that the local mayor or the local governor or the national government of the country is concerned, try to regain what they've lost in the last century. But I think in the case of the Pergamon finds, their demands are on a very weak basis, legally certainly, but also morally, because you can't neglect the argument that the parts were about to be destroyed by the local Turks, and Karl Humann and the Germans saved them for humanity.
Sure, at that time most of the people in Anatolia don't know about the history, don't know about the altar of Zeus. It's not a guilt. It's normal. But now, the people in Anatolia, the people in Pergamon, know the history, know the altar of Zeus. And we thank very much to German people, to German officials, that they keep our altar of Zeus for 120 years. I thank them. They keep it. It's very nice thing. But now, we know the importance of altar of Zeus. We can keep it.
I don't see much point in returning them to the hill of Pergamon now, after so many years.
The point is that however valuable the altar has been for bolstering Germany's morale, it might be more appropriate on its original site. It could hardly look worse than it does in its dingy setting in Berlin. The frieze cries out for the bright sky of the Aegean, not a battery of television lights. The recreation of the altar may have appealed to German taste, but distracts attention from the frieze. It looks like the set of a Cecil B. DeMille epic.
Many find that the present display is not ideal. The frieze, for instance, should be turned to the other side. It does not correspond to the original placement on the hill of Pergamon.
The challenge of installing the frieze in a new museum, on the acropolis at Pergamon, would make any contemporary architect's mouth water. Some Turkish archaeologists think that a reproduction of the frieze here would be just as good. Ironically, the Germans have financed the restoration of the nearby Roman temple of Trajan, but aren't prepared to fork out any more, even on a reproduction of the frieze.
I think it would be a fair solution to the problem. Of course, it's a major financial problem. Technically, it could be done, I think. The techniques that we dispose of today would allow a very good replica.
You mean a copy of...
A copy of it?
No.
Why not?
Why not? Because I say something. Zeus altar belongs to Pergamon, the real altar, not copy of altar. I want a real altar. It's a historical bond. I don't want copy. I don't want altar as a show or as an American movie, historical movie. I want a part of my town back, not a copy of it.
All the mayor's claims about the illegal removal of the frieze are being investigated by a new Turkish government commission. No bill of sale exists, but subject to the commission's report, the Germans appear to have acquired the frieze legally, by 19th century standards at least. German moral claims to have rescued the frieze need to be taken with a large pinch of salt. It's in aesthetic, historical and emotional terms that the removal of the frieze from Pergamon should be considered as plunder, however civilized its disguise.
In next week's Plunder at the same time, Nicholas Ward Jackson considers the Venus de Milo.